This week on Just Solutions, we look at what's next for America 2 weeks after the guilty verdict in the Chauvin trial, with the number of people who have died at the hands of police still growing. How do we confront the issue of policing and race? Today's guest is civil and human rights activist, journalist and author Kevin Powell. His latest book is When We Free the World, a collection of essays that examine racism, fear and division, while at the same time offering a hopeful road to healing. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Well, Kevin, it's great to have you with us. And that intro really doesn't do you justice, because you're a playwright, you're a poet, you're a hip hop historian, and so much more. And we're going to delve into much of that today. But thank you so much for joining us. And I'd like to start by talking about mental health, because May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and you've been a huge advocate for mental health and writing and speaking so openly about your own path with mental health. I know the Chauvin trial was a traumatizing event for so many people, but particularly members of the Black community who had to witness the violence of that video played out over and over and over again. And think of that compounded with all of the images that we're constantly seeing of that same violence being perpetuated. The impact and the trauma that's happening right now, but the mental health impact on that. Would you like to talk about that initially? Because I don't think we talk about that enough. We talk about police reform. We talk about what we need to deal with when it comes to, societal and the structural racism. But it seems that we don't talk about the trauma and the mental health component of this.
Well, it's the history, sadly, of Black people in America. We've been perhaps one of the most loyal group of people to this country in wars and Olympic sports, everything. But we've also had to deal with trauma from the very beginning. Outside of Indigenous people who are called Native Americans, as you know, us, as enslaved people, kidnapped people, Africans who were turned into slaves, and rape, murder, body parts being cut off. This is all during 246 years of slavery, trauma after trauma after trauma. And then there's legalized segregation, Jim Crow, from the end of the Civil War right into the Civil Rights Movement of the 50s and 60s. The most famous image, sadly, tragically, is that of Black bodies hanging from trees. We know that May of this year, this month, is also the 100th anniversary of Tulsa, Oklahoma being destroyed by white supremacists who flew planes and bombed a Black community simply because they had Black businesses and they were trying to do for themselves, even in a segregated community. And then there's all the images we've seen since then of women and men, of Black folks throughout history, things like Emmett Till. And in the last couple of years, the stories of Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, the list is endless. And so absolutely, when we talk about racism, just like if you're a woman, you have to deal with sexism, you have to deal with a legacy of rape culture, of sexual assault, of street harassment. That's traumatizing. If you happen to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, the homophobia and the transphobia is traumatizing. If you're a disabled person, the ableism is traumatizing. So any group has ever had to deal with intense hatred in various forms, including violence, is going to have to deal with trauma. So for a lot of us, we were on pins and needles. We were waiting for the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial because many of us were expecting the worst, because we've seen this before where a police officer was caught on camera. Rodney King was beaten over 80 times by 4 police officers, and those 4 officers were found not guilty. And so that, even in itself, waiting for the verdict was traumatizing. So it's very important for us, absolutely, May being Mental Health Awareness Month, to talk about mental health, but also how do we begin to end these systems of discrimination, of hate, oppression, be it racism, sexism, all these systems that do these things to people just because of who they are.
Well, your book, which is a collection of essays, When We Free the World, it's a hopeful book, and really throughout all of your books, and I think this is the 14th one, as well as all of the articles that you've written and the other projects you've been involved in, you talk about your own personal transformation, certainly in the context of masculine toxicity, but also you give hope that transformation is possible. Do you think we're at a point right now where real transformation at a deep societal, institutional level can come about?
It can, because I think when we saw something about the George Floyd video, particularly, I've never had so many white sisters and brothers, white folks in this country from around the world asking, what should I read? What should I watch? What should I listen to? What can I do? I apologize. Do you want to talk? That's not, many of us who are Black had never had that kind of experience. And that's where transformation happens, when people are willing to begin to re-educate themselves and rethink everything they've been taught. The same thing goes for sexism, for toxic masculinity, toxic manhood. I mean, I literally grew up only learning about men in math, in science, in literature, in everything. And so there's little wonder that I or any of us who identify as males would be sexist, because we were taught very early on by the school system, our families, our communities, religious institutions, the mass media culture, that women are simply caretakers or mother figures to men and boys, or sadly sex objects, or even worse, punching bags, something to be harmed, And so it takes an education. I would not be able to talk about toxic manhood if it wasn't for women interrupting my sexist behavior and saying, you need to read V, formerly E. Winslow, you need to read Gloria Steinem, you need to read bell hooks, you need to read Audre Lorde. You really need to understand that this is a system of power that you've been participating in unwittingly, that you have something called male privilege, just like white brothers and sisters, white folks need to understand there is white skin privilege in the context of white supremacy. And so, I want us to get to a world where we actually respect and honor each other as equals, as equal human beings, no matter what our identity or identities. But I'm so clear, it's not going to happen without a massive re-education. And I think the 4 years of Donald Trump's horrific presidency that was rooted in racism and sexism and every other kind of ism and phobia we can think of, plus what happened with George Floyd on that video for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, and people just watching him being kneed to death, literally. I think it shook the conscience of America, but also shook the conscience of many people around the world. And that is where you begin to see a shift, but it's got to be consistent. Let's not forget the civil rights movement. The heart of it was 1955 to 1968. That was 13 years of work by Black folks, white folks, people of all different backgrounds. This is not going to change in a matter of just 1 year after George Floyd being killed. We need to be sustained in our efforts to affect this change. That's the only way it's going to flip.
Well, particularly when we see how deep-rooted all of these inequities are. It's at the very foundation of this country, the theft of land from Indigenous people. And then, of course, the economic foundation of this country is built on the backs of slaves. And in one of the essays in your collection, an essay really that addresses the Me Too movement, you had this phrase that just has jumped out at me: power forever panics under siege. When we're seeing power structures right now being challenged, what do you see as the panic that might result as a knee-jerk reaction? I mean, what do progressives and people who really want to see those structures change need to be on the lookout for?
Well, one, I mean, think about, we're talking about the Me Too movement, folks passing laws state by state in America that further determines what women can and cannot do with their bodies, laws being passed all over the place to further suppress voter turnout, the possibilities of voter turnout, laws that are affecting people who have been marginalized. And that's what right-wing repressive regimes do. How can we stop these people from, even the fact that laws being passed for how people can protest in different cities, when it should be our democratic right, it's supposed to be our democratic right according to the United States Constitution, for us to be able to assemble peacefully. But even there, you've got people talking about, well, maybe we should take away their right to vote. Maybe we should just lock them up in jail. Maybe we should make it a federal crime, a felony. Just for protesting. And we know, because we do know the history of this country and many countries around the world, that nothing changes unless people are out there actually protesting, marching, rallying, saying enough of this unjust treatment. And that goes for women, for people of color, immigrant groups of any background. That goes for any folks who feel like they've been left out of the democracy or the opportunities that country claims to represent for all people.
Well, the first essay in your new book is so powerful. It's Letter to My Unborn Child, and it's a letter to the child that you hope to have. And I think this is what is something that we need to understand, that this is something Black families, Black parents have to have in their consciousness, that other communities just don't, and particularly white people, that you have this inherent fear that your child could end up like George Floyd or Michael Brown or Eric Gardner, or indeed the children that are being killed at the hands of police. It's a powerful, powerful essay, Kevin, and it really speaks from your heart. But I think it's something that so many people need to hear, that the ripple effects, and this goes back to what we talked about, the trauma of living in this society as a person of color, but particularly as a Black person. Tell us more about that essay, why you wanted to write it, and why we need to really hear that as a society.
Because I'm terrified of having a child, honestly, in this society. Because I, at my lifetime, as I talk about in that essay, was brutalized by a police officer when I was 15 years old, and I don't want to see a child that I have or any children have to go through that. And sadly, this is our reality, that we have to have this conversation. It's not just with the so-called male children either; it's with all the children, no matter what their gender identities are. If you happen to have black skin, if you appear to be black in this society, we're still looked at as three-fifths of a human being, which is language that was put into the United States Constitution by the founding fathers to further dehumanize the people that they were keeping as slaves. And so we know that black life has never been valued in this society, and that certainly includes our children. And so Tamir Rice was a child. Makisha Bryant, who was killed by the police officer in Columbus, Ohio, days back, was also a 16-year-old. She was a girl. She was a kid. You could hear a bystander saying, a witness to it saying, she's a kid, man. She's a kid to the police officer. And so when we think about these situations, for me to write that essay, I'm saying, my God, what are the conversations I'm going to have with a child if they happen to be black? They will be black, and what they're going to have to deal with. I'm going to have to tell them the truth that you are going to have to guard your life very closely. And even that may not be enough, because someone may kill you simply because you're black, or black female, black girl, or black woman, or because you happen to be a black, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender person, just because of who you are. And that's tragic to me. And, we cannot claim continually that this is a democracy when everyone in the democracy don't feel safe simply because of who they are.
Well, the Chauvin trial has led to conversations that maybe we have not had before as a society, across different sectors of society, about what policing looks like in this country. And there are conversations about police reform, but there are also louder and louder conversations happening about dismantling the police as we know it. It's not about having a lawless society with no type of policing at all, but it's recognizing that the institution of policing right now does not work, or maybe it's working to uphold the white supremacist society. So maybe it's working perfectly functional in the way it was designed to, but it is not effective for policing right now through civil and social rights lens. What are the conversations we need to be having in terms of the opportunities that there are right now around not just reforming the police, but really having a system in place that works for everybody?
Well, I think this is where American history is important. And unfortunately, a lot of people in our country do not understand American history. The police department, as it's constructed, literally was modeled after the slave patrols, going back to the history of slavery in this country, which monitored and harassed and captured and killed people who had escaped from slavery, slave patrols. And it became what we know now as the modern police force. And so there was always the foundation of it was a hostile relationship between the white stakeholders or power holders in this country and the black community, or communities of color, or poor communities, or marginalized communities. And so that's part of the problem. Number two, we understand that police officers being asked to do many things they're not qualified to do. They are not mental health experts by any stretch of the imagination. They have no knowledge, many of them, about how to deal with people who are disabled. And so think about the number of people who have been shot by the police, murdered by the police, who have had mental health issues, who have been disabled, and these officers are being out there asked to patrol everything. And then a lot of the calls to police officers are for intimate partner situations, domestic violence situations, or mental health situations. And so why are they the first responders to the type of things when they have been trained in many cases poorly, I would say, with some exceptions, because there are police officers who I know, who are friends, who are family members, who are in forces around the country, say you should not be shooting first. But many are coming with their guns drawn. I mean, look what happened to Mr. Wright in Minnesota, where he was pulled over for some minor infraction, and then he ends up getting killed. Literally getting killed with his girlfriend sitting next to him, leaving behind a child. And so we have to revamp the police department. There has to be massive federal change here. This is why the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act needs to be passed by the United States Senate. Congress has already passed it. The Republicans, or there needs to be a coalition of folks. Joe Biden called for it in his address to the joint session of Congress. We need to revamp all of this, whatever you want to call it. I'm not going to get into semantics. Should it be defund the police, dismantle the police? But this is not working, because what we are at now are pandemic levels, just like COVID is a pandemic. We are at pandemic levels of Black and brown people being killed by the police over and over again in a way that we have not seen people being killed since you saw people hanging from trees in this country in the first half of the last century. It's that bad. It is that horrific, where even I, as I drive around, I know what to do if I'm confronted by the police. I know to keep my hands. I know I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't do drugs, but I know I'm paranoid that it's something that I'll be accused of something. I know all those things, and I still fear that if I drive, I may get killed simply because I'm driving a car. That is unacceptable in a so-called democratic society. So it has to change. It has to change, because basically when you don't change it, you're saying it's okay for us to just kill people just because of who they are and deal with the consequences afterwards. What kind of society is that claims to be civilized, that allows that to happen over and over again?
Of course, that goes deeper even than policing. It's just society in general. And you write in your new collection of essays that many white people in America see Black people through a twisted lens, as morally bankrupt, who cannot be trusted or believed. Now, we've seen what's happening with police, but that's also playing out in schools. The disproportionate policing, essentially, of Black children, the fact that there are even police officers, call them whatever you want, school resource officers, they're cops and they're in schools. And very often it's the Black children and the children of color that are bearing the brunt of it. I mean, we often talk about the school to prison pipeline, the criminalization of young Black people because they're perceived in a way that's different from their white peers.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. This is the root cause of racism. Racism is race plus power. Racism is race plus power. And so who has the power gets to dictate what happens in all these institutions, be it schools, be it how police are monitoring and relating to communities, even how information is put out there. Because if you continually demonize any group of people and say that they're dangerous, they're threatening in some form or fashion, then we need to have law and order for that. I mean, again, you talked about my work around sexism, around toxic manhood, the parallel that I throw all the time. Think about the things that are said about women over and over again, present day, historically, to criminalize, demonize, to make women feel like they are subhuman. Well, the same exact thing happens to Black and brown and people of color over and over again. And so, that has to change. I mean, the problem to me is that we have all been grossly miseducated about ourselves and each other, because it benefits the 1% in this country to keep people uneducated and fighting each other. So let's have racism, let's have sexism, let's have homophobia, let's have transphobia, let's have classism, let's have all these ableism, have all these different divisions and hatreds toward each other. And it keeps those folks who want to have power in power. And what we're saying is what we really need is a people's movement in this country. You can call it Black Lives Matter, you can call it Me Too, you can call it whatever you like, but there needs to be a coming together of folks who understand that white supremacy and patriarchy are not acceptable in any society that claims to be a democracy, that it actually does damage to all of us, no matter who we are, even the folks who benefit from sexism, men, or the folks who benefit from racism, white folks, are also being badly damaged by these systems, because we're not even getting to be our full human selves, because we're constantly acting on some ridiculous and corrupt, spiritually, morally, intellectually script that we've been given. And so this is what all the pushback is happening, I believe, over the last year with the protests. It's like, we have to change this. Have to change this. And the reality is, just like sexism will not end until men actually start saying down with toxic manhood. The same thing with racism in America. It will not end until white people. It can't just be Black people, Latinx people, and Native American people, and Asian people, people of color saying it. White folks have got to say enough of white supremacy. This has got to end. That's when it changes.
Well, we'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching from right now, and let us know your thoughts on this. Many people feel that we are at some type of tipping point, but we need to move ahead with that energy. So let us know your thoughts in the comments. Now, Kevin, one of your previous books was My Mother, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and the Last Stand of the Angry White Man. Well, we know what happened in the last election, but we also saw what happened on January 6th. And we also see the continuing influence of Donald Trump on the Republican Party. So the angry white man still seems to be standing, very much so. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is the nature of racism, or what some people call white supremacy. And the tragedy of it is that, you know, people like Donald Trump who have great wealth could care less about working class white people, could care less about middle class white people. They are simply being manipulated around skin color, around white supremacy, around racism. And the reality is, I have more in common with those folks that were leading that riot, that rebellion, that insurrection on January 6th financially than I or they have with Donald Trump. That's just a fact. But that's part of how this system has always worked in our society, is that, you know, you'll have the wealthy white folks pitting working class, middle class white folks, you know, against people of color and blaming them, because what we do in this country is other people. And it's not just white people and people of color. We've done this. White people have done this to Jewish people. They've done it to Irish people. They've done it to Italian people. They've done it to, you know, all kinds of folks who were new immigrants to the country. And so we just need to look at the history. Go watch Martin Scorsese's film, Gangs of New York, where you see the native whites having major problems with the new whites or Europeans, the ethnic whites who are coming to the country. And so I think that's really the crux of it. When you see this, type of rebellion happening, it's not so much, they have been taught fear of people who are different than them. And they don't even know who they are. And they're claiming that they're going to save America. They're going to make America great again for people. And, you know, we're going to reclaim our country. But I'm like, if you're really talking about reclaiming the country, it actually belongs to indigenous people, Native American people whose land was stolen. Reclaiming the country, I mean, the very capital that they were storming was built by African people, Black people who were slaves, who worked to build most of Washington, D.C. The city that you stormed, Washington, D.C., was actually created. The grid was created by a Black man, a free Black man named Benjamin Banneker, who was a contemporary of Thomas Jefferson. So the irony and the tragedy of it all is that a lot of these folks who are claiming all these things and saying all these things and feeling so terrified don't even know the country that they live in. They know nothing about the history of it. They're just speaking what they've been given, these talking points from the Donald Trumps and the Fox News channel, folks like Tucker Carlson, which is de facto and in fact racism, because racism is built on fear and hatred.
So much of your work as a journalist and a writer is taking a look at culture and music, sports as well. I know you're a huge sports fan, but in terms of music and culture, I mean, what role does the artist, the musician, the poet have in moving us into action, into positive action, particularly at this point that we're at, where there does seem to be the possibility, at least, of some type of change? I mean, I know you're writing biography about Tupac Shakur, you're a hip hop historian, you've really documented the role that hip hop has played. But, you know, looking back to the civil rights era, of course, musicians and music was a huge part of that. I mean, what role did the cultural brokers, the poets, the artists, the musicians have to play right now?
Artists have to step up. I'm talking about singers, rappers, dancers, filmmakers, choreographers, visual artists. Artists should be the truth tellers for our society at any given time in history. And you're right. When you look back to the 60s and 70s, I mean, Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan, Sam Cooke, Aretha Franklin, Curtis Mayfield. If you go globally, people like Fela Kuti out of Nigeria, Bob Marley out of Jamaica. I mean, the John Lennon, you know, I mean, what song is more powerful than Imagine, you know, which is really his magnum opus in terms of what he saw humanity could be. And so we need those kind of songs now. One of the things that saddens me as such a lover of music is seeing a lot of artists saying they want to do something, but they keep remaking old songs over and over again. Enough of remaking Imagine or We Are the World or whatever it is, or saying this is the 2021 version. If you really are an artist, whether you're a famous artist or an up and coming artist or someone in the middle, we need new songs, new poems, new books, new essays, new blogs, new dance pieces, new films that really speak to our times, because art is supposed to reflect what's going on in the society, but also art, if it's great art, tells us what's possible. When you listen to Sam Cooke's song, A Change Is Gonna Come, it tells us what's possible. John Lennon's Imagine tells us what's possible. And I really believe that's what we need to get to. And I think that it's sad to me. I see it in places, but we need more of it, because it's how do you go through the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter and everything else that is happening over just the last 5 or 6 years, and there's not a whole body of art across the country that's speaking to these times. That's what's needed. I challenge myself on that. I challenge fellow artists on that. That's why I'm working on a play right now about manhood. That's why I'm working on a film as well with a soundtrack, you know, of new and established artists about manhood as well. Because I'm like, we need to create what we want to see. This is what Toni Morrison, the great writer, said. That's what artists should be doing, creating what we need to see in our world, in our society.
And I know you're a voracious reader as well, Kevin, and you've said that your tipping point almost for transformation was, I think you were 18 and you read the biography of Malcolm X, and that we need to read more and read outside our life experiences, because of course reading creates empathy, and consuming culture from other realms of experience can generate empathy in us as well. I mean, that's a crucial part of this, and that seems to be necessary right from the youngest age.
Oh, I agree. I mean, like, I am proud to be a Black person, African American, but I love people of all different backgrounds. I don't care if you're Puerto Rican, Dominican, Mexican, Irish, Jewish, Italian, if you're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, atheist, agnostic. You know, I want to learn about people of all different backgrounds, any gender identity. I've always been intellectually curious. I think we do ourselves a disservice by not reading, by not forever being students of life, of people. I mean, it's food, it's culture, it's music, it's everything. And we have to travel. One of my sayings when I give speeches, I always say to young people, please repeat after me, hashtag read, study, travel, hashtag read, study, travel. You know, I realized when I first left the country, America, years ago, I went to Paris, France in the 1990s. I'd never left the country. I didn't know how to pack anything. I went there expecting people to speak English. And I was like, you don't speak English? They're like, no. And it's like, learn how to speak French and learn how to learn our culture. And here I was living through the eyes of American at the time. And, you know, where's McDonald's at? Looking for the American things. That's not the way to grow as a human being. And you want to know why things like racism and sexism, et cetera, that we've been talking about exist? Because most of us don't know who we are, nor do we have any knowledge, most of us, about people who are different than us. You know, for me as a man, when I was challenged about this, my internalized sexism, my patriarchy, my misogyny in my 20s, the first thing that was said to me by women was, you have to read women writers. You have to read women thinkers. And I felt embarrassed because I realized here I was, someone who had gone to college, was a great student growing up, and I had barely ever read anything that was written by women other than Emily Dickinson and Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. That was it. Emily's poetry and Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. One book. How can you even say that you are an enlightened person and you call yourself a man or a male, and you don't know, you know little to nothing about half America's population, half the world's population? I realized what a disservice I was doing to myself. And, you know, I had to go through an internal revolution, or evolution, if you will. And as I was coming out of it, I realized, you know what, I'm not losing something by listening to the voices of women and girls, hearing their stories. I'm actually gaining a greater sense of my own humanity, because I now understand why women are talking about rape culture, about sexual assault. I now understand why my mother would say things over and over again about how my father was disrespectful to her, how certain kinds of men are no good. She wasn't just saying that just to say it. She was talking from her real lived experiences. And my responsibility for my mother and all women was to listen. And as you said, begin to develop compassion, and most importantly, empathy, and become an ally. The reason why we see so many divisions and people don't even want to support each other, like, what's wrong with these Black people, what's wrong with these women, or what's wrong with the queer folks or the disabled folks, is because we don't have any empathy for each other, because we don't even pay attention to what people are saying. I had white friends say to me, it wasn't until the George Floyd video a year ago that they actually realized Black people were telling the truth. I'm like, we've been saying this forever. We've been putting out the books, the poems, the essays forever. You know what I mean? You chose to ignore it. And so that's why reading is important. You know, study is important, travel is important, because you have to be connected to other human beings. Yes, I'm proud to be Black, but I'm also proud to be a member of the human race. It's not an either or, it's both.
Well, Miriam's watching right now in Colorado, and she says that before anything changes, we all need to acknowledge that we have a problem. That, of course, goes to the heart of what you're saying, Kevin. Well, we just have a minute left. Of course, we could talk to you all day. You have so much to say, but just the theme of your collection of essays is inherently hopeful, and even the title, because it's when we free the world, not if we free the world, when. Yeah. So in the last minute that we have, Kevin, what gives you hope?
The children, the young people on the cover of that book, look at the backgrounds of those young people. They're parts of what Fred Hampton, the former Black Panther Party chairman for Illinois, called the Rainbow Coalition. Look at the diversity of those young people. That's intentional. That photo for that cover was inspired by a Jewish brother who went to high school with James Baldwin in New York, Richard Avedon, who took a photo of Black and white young civil rights workers in the 1960s that really touched my heart. And I decided I wanted to recreate that image for this book, When We Free the World. It's young people that give me hope, and older people who are willing to listen and to evolve give me hope. We just have to open our hearts up. What gives me hope, ma'am, is love, love, love. I believe in it for the rest of my life. And I think if we don't love ourselves and don't love other people, nothing's going to change. But I have to believe that that's possible. I'm proof of it. I am proof of it.
Well, Kevin Powell, it's so great to read your books, read your articles, and get to talk to you in person. It's a real privilege for me. Thank you so much for taking time to talk to us on Free Speech TV.
Thank you so much. It's my honor.
Well, join us next week on Just Solutions. We're going to take a look ahead to the centenary commemoration of the Greenwood Massacre that took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. That's next week, same time, same place, right here on Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.